there are pushbacks against the evidences that, you're going to be sharing today.
There's this notion out there that you can't be a professional CrossFit athlete without steroids.
When they come to you as an athlete, what's the battery of tests you usually put them through?
I kind of got into a sticky situation online.
All right, Paul, we're recording. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Clint.
So, training practices in bodybuilding in the 70s or even in the 80s were wild. Do you think we're in that phase right now with CrossFit?
Yeah, that was an analogy that I used on a podcast episode where I was remembering pumping iron and Lou Ferrigno in a carpeted gym doing partial ROM push presses and shouting Arnold while he's doing them. And for a lot of reasons, no bodybuilders do push presses anymore, let alone like a partial range of motion push press so I use that as an example as to how training practices evolve. And for the most part, they evolve through scientific evidence. And the implementation is usually downstream of the scientific evidence. So when a new study comes out that talks about a particular way to train, like a modern one would be like velocity-based training and strength training, people are really slow to accept it and implement it at scale. And then it takes a few decades for those sorts of training practices to become commonplace in gyms. So with athletes and coaches. So yeah, I do think that in many ways, CrossFit, we shouldn't expect to be super sophisticated as far as how we train for it because we're so early on in this thing. The games really became a thing in 2010, 2014. And, so we're like in the first 15 years of this thing, really. And so we have a long way to go. And yeah, we just need to keep learning. So
there are pushbacks against the evidences that, you're going to be sharing today. So to set the stage, how about we start with, the profile of an elite athlete? What do they look like?
Yeah, so there was a study out of Norway where they took 19 international level CrossFit athletes and put them on a DEXA and had them do various tests. And I don't know the female numbers off the top of my head, but the male numbers were 165 pounds of lean mass, 195 pounds of body weight on average. That was like the mean. And they squat 2.1 times body weight or 415. And they have a VO2 max of 62, and they are really, really good at anaerobic power. So they did a 30-second anaerobic Wingate test. So those were the tests that they did. The VO2 max test was on a treadmill. Yeah, so they were really exceptional in muscle mass, in aerobic capacity, and in anaerobic capacity.
Mm-hmm. So for the VO2 max, to give everyone context about 62, is that good?
It's elite, yeah. Yeah, so it's on par with elite endurance athletes in Norway.
So if they have those profiles, right, is it the result of preparing for the games programming?
Yeah, that's what we don't know right now. And the researchers did have a line in the study where they suggest that future research should try to elucidate whether they have that much muscle mass because they train that way. The muscle mass specifically is like a really surprising number because they have more muscle mass than like alpinists in Norway, when that's like a big sport in Norway that attracts a lot of their best athletes. And they have more muscle mass, and the VO2 max numbers were similar. So the researchers suggested that we need to figure out, kind of pull apart why these athletes are so exceptional. Is it because of the training, or is it because of their genetics?
Now that you mentioned genetics, so when it comes to the games, right, or elite athletes, is it genetics or steroids?
Well, I kind of got into a kind of like sticky situation online because there was a study that was published out of Brazil where they said in the title of the study and in the text of the study that they had surveyed professional CrossFit athletes, and that 33% of those athletes were on anabolic androgenic steroids. So I published that information on my podcast and on my Instagram, and 33% is, according to some accounts, pretty on par with what we would expect in any elite sport where there's lots of resources. So it wasn't like out of left field or anything like that. It wasn't claiming like 100% or something like that. And I felt like publishing it because there's this notion out there that you can't be a professional CrossFit athlete without steroids, and that 100% of the athletes are on steroids, which is a very high burden of proof. And so this was a piece of evidence that not 100% of elite CrossFit athletes are on steroids. And so I published it, and then somebody messaged me that they had been in touch with the head researcher on it And that researcher said they made a mistake and that they had actually surveyed amateur CrossFit athletes. And so I had to take the post down, and now I know to, take certain studies with a grain of salt and maybe even reach out to the researcher before communicating it, to my audience. So that was like a lesson learned for me. If it's something that's going to be particularly inflammatory or newsworthy like that. So I can't speculate as to the number of professional CrossFit athletes that are on steroids. I thought that we had evidence on that, but it turns out we don't. But the 100% argument is a really high burden of proof. So I think that's very, very unlikely that it's 100%. It's understandable that people have that perspective. CrossFit athletes are very exceptional, but I do like to look at the NFL especially, and you have 240-pound running backs who are 12% body fat. And then people come back to me and say, well, all those guys are on steroids and have been since they were, I'm like, really? When they were 18 and coming out of poverty, you think they were using test when they were in that scenario? It's
they're
like
expensive.
And they're like, oh yeah, you just don't, you're just naive or whatever. And I like the burden of proof concept, because the burden of proof that more and more people are on steroids, like the higher the percentage you want to say are on steroids, the higher the burden of proof is, and the less and less likely it becomes. People are just cynical. That's my, I think if you trace that sentiment to kind of the feeling or to kind of the philosophy or the worldview, it's cynicism.
So based on the profiles that you shared about elite CrossFitters, I mean, how should like an aspiring competitor train then?
Yeah, so I believe in individualization. That's why I work with athletes one-on-one. I have had people reach out to me saying, I want to implement your methodology in my gym or with my clients. How do I do that? And I realized that because I was getting that question, I was sending the wrong message. I was sending the message that this is how everyone should train. Everyone should get stronger or whatever. And I have clients who do virtually no strength training. So that felt wrong to me, that people were getting that message from my content. So I am a big believer in individualization. I think it has a maximizing effect on your results as an athlete, especially in CrossFit, because you have multiple disciplines. If you just want to say, this is my method for barbell strength, it's starting strength, it's 5-3-1, it's west side, it's conjugate, whatever, that's fine. But in CrossFit, you have multiple disciplines. And so an example I used recently was Brent Fikowski came into the sport, exceptional at endurance, and has prioritized strength for his entire career, and has significantly closed the gap between his strength and his endurance. And Matt Fraser was the opposite. And he was working with Chris Hinshaw and going to the track multiple times a week. If they had done each other's programs, they would have got significantly worse results. And their poor results would have stayed poor, and their good results would have stayed good. And so really the answer is to train your weakness.
How about this scenario? We have a 150-pound male, has good cardio.
A 150-pound male needs to do bodybuilding, probably for multiple years, and needs to learn how to eat more.
Let's say the generic 10 sessions per week. How would you allocate the bodybuilding session, like getting stronger? What's the percentage that you would allocate towards Metcon and long duration cardio?
A 150-pound male, I would say none. I would say no Metcons, because you need to add 45 pounds, and that's going to take a while. So every Metcon you do is basically prolonging your arrival at that profile. I have clients who are 170-pound males, and for large chunks of the offseason this year, they didn't do any high-intensity conditioning.
How would that help their performance? Like when they say they have to compete, let's say in a local competition, just to get their feet wet though?
Yeah, it wouldn't. So the trade-off is you sacrifice your short-term preparedness to compete for your long-term development.
So what about the opposite? 245, running back from NFL, and then wants to do CrossFit. How would that person train?
It's the complete opposite, like you said. Typically, those guys have a high proportion of fast-twitch muscle fibers and obviously a lot of muscle mass. So they're very, very strong. And they generally fatigue more quickly. Being faster twitch, you fatigue more quickly. It's the downside. But a lot of elite athletes in CrossFit have that setup. And so you just need to expend a lot of energy, whether that's in CrossFit or through endurance modalities. The closer you are to competing, the more CrossFit it would be. There are some football players who are really, really strong squat, bench, deadlift, and can't snatch 55% of what they back squat. And so that person would need to snatch twice a week. but if they're snatching 65% of their back squat and they squat really big, then you can do none. 65%. So you want to snatch 65% of your back squat.
Yeah, where did that number come from?
That number just comes from clinical experience. Coaches who have worked with lots of athletes, and that's what we see with CrossFitters.
For someone then who's like already been a CrossFitter, they're closer to fitting the profile of an elite athlete. What's the training like for that individual?
Yeah, so the way I answer this question is look at your competition results. That's the first thing. So if you already meet the profile and you can do all the things that the baseline things that an elite athlete can do, and you have the body that you need, just look at your competition results, and those often will tell you a story about what you need to prioritize. And for the person who's like, well, what about me? All of my competition results are really similar. What should I do? Then I like to look at training age, set point, and trainability. Training age is how long have you been training in each discipline? Set point is what did you come out of the box with? What were you like before you had any training at all in each discipline? And your trainability is how fast and how much do you respond to training relative to other people. So if you need to get more granular with it, those are the 3 questions that I would ask yourself.
When they come to you as an athlete, what's the battery of tests you usually put them through? Can you like give me some examples of those?
Yeah, for sure. So I start with a functional movement screen, and that doesn't tell me that much unless it's a master's athlete, because they usually have really tight shoulders or really tight hips, really tight ankles or something. But for an individual athlete, that doesn't usually tell me that much. So I have to put them through harder and harder stuff to see what's going on. I typically won't have them max out the first week of working with me. I'll typically put them into an off-season style strength program. So I'll say, do a 5x5 back squat with 75% of your 1RM. And then I look at the bar speed and how it's moving and what their positions are like. And generally from that, I can see a lot. I can see how I don't need to have somebody max out to tell how strong they are. And then gymnastics, I'll usually put them into an off-season style gymnastic strength training program. If you want to get into the details of that, I can get into the details of it. But
Let's do that. I was actually going to ask you this question anyway. So now that you mention it.
Yeah. So gymnastic strength training is just how gymnasts train to get strong, do all the dynamic stuff they do. It's all strict stuff, all the strict stuff they do to be able to do their routines. And the standards for it are really, really high. So in CrossFit, we say we do gymnastics, but really we do gymnastic strength training. We do rope climbs and handstand push-ups. And those are not routines in gymnastics that get scored. If a gymnast just went up there and just did handstand push-ups on the rings, like they would get no points. It's like you have to do something way harder than that in order to get a score. So the handstand push-ups are what they do to be able to do their routines. So that's what we do in CrossFit. And so gymnastic strength training is a really specific way for a CrossFitter to get better at gymnastics in CrossFit, because the hardest contractions we do in CrossFit, upper body wise, gymnastics wise, are a seated legless rope climb and a 10-inch wall facing deficit handstand push-up. Those are the hardest contractions you're going to have to do. So those are basically the final stage in gymnastic strength training before you get into routines. They come out of their 16-week off season and they're like, I feel like I'm floating. One of my hobbies is talking about gymnastic strength training, because the problem of a muscle up and the problem of a handstand push-up has been solved. There is no mystery as far as how to attain those things. And it comes through several sets a week of really hard contractions in the 1 to 5 rep range in a gymnastic strength training progression that's appropriate for that individual. So the reason this is a hobby of mine is there are a lot of, I'm sure, very well-meaning and very competent gymnastics coaches who, at least it would appear from the outside looking in, that they emphasize skill drills. They emphasize technique a lot. And for handstand hold and walk, and yeah, that is a skill. That is a skill. And you actually don't need very high levels of strength in order to do that really well. But most of the stuff that we do inside of CrossFit is just bearing down and doing some hard contractions in your upper body when it comes to the gymnastics. So that is solved by gymnastic strength training. And I was really lucky to be gifted a book called Building the Gymnastic Body by a guy named Christopher Sommer, Coach Sommer, who's been deeply involved with USA Gymnastics for decades. And I was gifted it when I was 20. And so I got really lucky because I kind of got exempted from the CrossFit introduction to gymnastics because I had done that. for multiple years. So when I showed up to CrossFit, I could do muscle ups. I could do everything. That was my personal experience with it. But I do think that oftentimes in CrossFit gyms, having been inside them and seeing people kick up against the wall who shouldn't, a lot, seeing that a lot. Or, oh, you can't do pull-ups or you can't do muscle ups. Why don't you just do ring rows? And do them as fast as you can. Transition between the movements as fast as you can because you're racing your friends. If you ever want to do a muscle up, then this approach, whether it's emphasizing skill drills and you got to put your band around the foot this way and you got to set up the box like this so you can swing this way. I immediately ask, what is your weighted pull-up? Can you do a pull-up on a rope? And if you can do those things, then a muscle up is not that hard. It's really not. And I think that oftentimes people don't want to tell people that because the class is not set up for doing 60 minutes of hard contractions. I know there are some gyms out there that do that, but most gyms are not set up for that because you don't get the Metcon. You don't get the stress response. You don't get the shared suffering. You don't get all the things that come along with that, the loud music, etc. So that's fine. You don't have to get people the result that they want if the result they want is a muscle up or handstand push up or a ring muscle up. But they should know that. They should know that the 10 ring rows in the Metcon are not moving them closer to that, and that there is a path that they can choose if they really do want that. And it's just unfortunate that people have to select out of the class in order to pursue that path.
So for the competitors who don't know anything about this, how does it look like to train in gymnastics?
So there's 6 patterns: pushing, pulling, shoulder articulation, body line, sideline, and compression. In the off season, I have my CrossFitters train all of those. So those are the 6 patterns. And to train all 6 of those patterns, that's a full training session. That's an hour and a half, 2 hours of training.
How often?
2 to 3 times a week, usually 2, and 3 to 5 sets of 1 to 5 RM. And if it's a hold, like an isometric or an eccentric only movement, like a negative, then it's anywhere from 10 seconds to 60 seconds that you're working. Yeah. But 1 to 5 RM.
Give me an example of like a progression. Like you said, there was like 10 levels, right?
So that's the gymnastics level system. And that's once you get into doing routines.
Oh, yeah.
So
okay.
In CrossFit, we're before that. I can kind of go through each pattern and what are progressions that a lot of CrossFitters would do well to train.
That would be
and
awesome.
Are stuck on.
Yeah, let's do that.
So for pushing, a lot of CrossFitters need to do box headstand push-ups. So you are in an L, a 90-degree compressed position with your feet on a box, doing a handstand push-up. And then you gradually add a deficit to that. And when you're doing 5x5 of those to a 10-inch deficit, then you are definitely prepared to kick up against the wall and do wall-facing handstand push-up, strict handstand push-up, gradually add deficit to that over time. So that's where a lot of CrossFitters are in their pushing. In their pulling, a lot of CrossFitters are at L pull-up or a tuck L pull-up and a rope pull-up. And the final step in that is a straddle L rope climb where you're holding, they do it in grid, but you're holding the L sit as you climb the rope. And gymnasts will actually do lock-offs. So they'll do that and then they'll let go with one hand and do like a 6-second negative and then grab the rope. So that's what they do. And even, Simone Biles does that stuff. So that's pushing and pulling. Those are the most common ones. Shoulder articulation is the planche progression. And most CrossFitters just need to do planche leans. So your feet are still in contact with the ground. You're just with straight arms in a front leaning rest, leaning forward as far as you can. Body line, I really like body levers. So you're anchored to something, you're lying like on the ground and you grab the rig behind your head and you lift your legs up and you hold that straight body position and lower your body down. And you can do negatives, you can do reps, but a lot of CrossFitters would do well to do some of that. Hollow rocks are also good. Sideline is just side plank rotation, star plank, and then compression is your L-sit variations. And sometimes if a guy is already really skilled in his gymnastics and just needs to gain lean body mass, then we might not do any gymnastic strength training. We might just do, bodybuilding style contractions because it is really hard to gain muscle with gymnastic strength training. You're putting plenty of mechanical tension through the muscle. You're just not doing that many reps. So it's really neural adaptations that you're driving with the gymnastic strength training. You can gain some muscle with it, but not like a ton. You're not going to go from 150 to 195 with gymnastic strength training. Those guys need to be doing, dumbbell bench press, weighted dip, bodybuilding stuff.
What are some training mistakes that you've seen most competitors, or even you, some mistakes that you've made, or some competitors that you've seen make?
Glad you asked it that way, because in a 60-second reel, it can sound like I'm an outsider, but in reality, I made all these mistakes myself. kind of what comes along with that is training with too much intensity. So especially high intensity conditioning, you get a really big stress response when you do high intensity conditioning. And there's no specific physiological reason for this, but it is just less sustainable over a career span. So if the competition is 3 weeks away and the competition you're training for has 8 events that are some variation of high intensity conditioning, then yeah, you need to do that much. But to do that much all the time without having the recovery resources of a professional athlete or the self-regulation ability of a professional athlete, then yeah, you end up with a lot of issues.
So if you're not used to, because competitions, right? If you're not used to those kinds of intensities though, is it bad for you to not dose yourself during training?
Yeah, you definitely have to be perceptually prepared for that by doing it in training, for sure. It's just not 48 weeks a year. It's more like 9 to 12 weeks a year. All of CrossFit happens in what's called the severe intensity domain, which is above your critical power, so above the second lactate threshold. And at those intensities, you gradually progress towards your VO2 max, towards your maximum metabolite tolerance, and eventually exhaustion. So we have a pretty good idea of what the fatigue mechanisms are, performance-wise, that limit us from going faster in CrossFit. It's your VO2 max, it's your ability to deal with hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphate and the depletion of phosphocreatine in the muscle. So that's kind of the physiology of it. But as far as like you were asking, how do you train for it? And yeah, you do need to touch those competition relevant paces frequently. You need to touch them often. It's just probably not 10 Metcons a week if you're also trying to get stronger. So that brings us to why shouldn't I do 10 Metcons a week? And the reason is the concurrent training effect. The concurrent training effect just states that above a certain volume of conditioning, you will slow down your strength gains. And you can actually make yourself weaker if you do enough conditioning. And many CrossFitters who are doing 10 Metcons a week are experiencing that. I certainly did when I was training. And I was wondering, why am I not gaining muscle mass? Why am I not getting stronger? And there are lots of physiological reasons for the concurrent training effect, but you just need to know that above a certain volume, your strength gains will slow down. And the more you do beyond that volume, the more they'll slow down.
What is concurrent training specifically?
Concurrent training is training strength and conditioning in the same week.
Do we know what the dose is? I mean, in general, where you're going to get affected by it?
Yeah, so it's not an exact number, but there are best practices from research and working with athletes. So if you have a priority for strength, you're really trying to gain muscle or you're really trying to get stronger, then I don't recommend more than 2 high intensity sessions per week. And even 2, and we're talking 30-minute working durations. So usually in the form of intervals of some kind. So not like, a 10-minute Metcon or something like quite a bit more work than that. No more than twice a week for that. And then low intensity conditioning, I keep it to 45 minutes or less, because every minute you get beyond 45 minutes, you make a glycogen depleted state more likely. And that seems to activate molecular pathways that are not good for getting stronger.
So now that you mentioned glycogen depleted, is it okay? Because there are some athletes who train fasted.
Generally not. So some endurance athletes will train fasted on purpose to get into the glycogen depleted state and activate those molecular pathways on purpose, because there is some evidence that those same pathways that inhibit your strength are good for aerobic adaptation. So there are some athletes that do that on purpose. But if you are trying to get stronger and maintain or make some slight improvements in your conditioning while you do that, then training fed and training as fresh as you can is a best practice. And even for athletes who are prioritizing conditioning, I don't mess around with training fasted.
So going back to the concurrent effect or concurrent training in general, what if there is an athlete out there who they have the strength back and then they have their endurance training? Can they do it at the same time, like one back to back?
Better to separate your sessions as much as you can.
How long?
So the more the better. So when you're designing your training split for the week, having different priorities, especially if you're trying to do strength and endurance training, especially hypertrophy training and endurance training concurrently, then separating them as much as possible is the best practice. If you're doing them in the same day, then separate sessions are better than mixed sessions. So even separating it by 3 to 6 hours with a meal or two is going to be better than doing it all at once.
What if someone wants to go pro, they're aspiring competitors, and they subscribe to some of the popular programs online? Are those programs appropriate or no? Or when can they be appropriate?
I can say with a very high degree of confidence that individualization will be better. How much better is the question, not whether or not it's better. But I think that in our community, we are still debating whether or not it's better. And that is slowing down the progress of a lot of athletes.
That said, then how should athletes train based on their level? So let's say for the purpose of this conversation, we got novice, quarterfinalists, semifinalists, and games athletes. So let's start with the novice, someone who's aspiring to be a competitor, but just pretty green in CrossFit.
Pretty green in CrossFit? Yeah. Of course, it depends on their training age in other disciplines. Are they gym bros? Have they done 4 years of bodybuilding? Or do they come from running and have no experience squatting, bending, lunging, pushing, or pulling? People come into CrossFit usually with some sort of training age. Usually people aren't coming into it. This is changing because of the popularity of the sport, but for most of the time that I've been around the sport, people are coming in their 20s with a training age in something else, and which is why they're attracted to CrossFit in the first place. Yeah, you have to look at that individual's training age, set point trainability, and what experience they have in squatting, bending, lunging, pushing, pulling. Because those are the things that, especially at the lower levels of competition, show up more than anything else. The vast majority of the competition is those 5 things. Mm-hmm. And so if you've done bodybuilding, then you're going to be set up a lot better for CrossFit than a runner.
So let's say for the open, they're preparing for the open. For the purpose of this conversation, maybe 2 months out?
2 months out from the open.
Would you look at the past data from past opens and say, all right, these are the percentages, these are the movements and modalities you're going to train?
Somebody who's done the open before, mm-hmm. and you see what they did, like somebody brand new walking into a CrossFit gym, mm-hmm. most people are not strong enough for CrossFit. Mm-hmm. So I will say that. Yeah. But if I just say like everyone should get stronger, then people leave the podcast thinking that all I got to do is strength train, So
I think where I'm going with this is like, would you, because like it's going to go towards, semifinals and games. Like, do you really need to swim if you're a quarterfinalist?
So to answer that question, no, a quarterfinal athlete does not need to be swimming ever, and neither does a semifinalist. I had a conversation with somebody where this athlete was saying, well, your heart doesn't know and my lungs don't know what modality I'm doing. And that's really what is adapting. And swimmers do almost no cross training outside of the pool. Cross training for an elite swimmer is doing an alternative stroke in the pool. And the same goes for runners. Runners don't do very much cross training at all. So you won't see a runner doing zone 2 sessions on a rower or a bike or anything, let alone swimming. Mm-hmm. So running and swimming, especially when we look at the training of elite endurance athletes, they do the least amount of cross training because the biomechanical demands of running and swimming are the most unique. Now, there is a significant cross training benefit between biking and rowing. So rowers will do quite a bit of cycling in the summer, and elite rowers will also do quite a bit of cross-country skiing in the winter if they live in a cold climate. So the muscle groups being used are similar, and the biomechanics are similar enough to where there's some transference there. So when we look at cross-training, it depends a lot on the modality. So if somebody is swimming, hoping that it will make them better at literally anything other than swimming, then that's probably not true. Same goes for running. But if you're a CrossFitter and you get tested in squatting and bending over and you row, then transference is pretty good there. It's really, really similar biomechanically. So yeah.
What if you're a quarterfinalist? Should you train for the workouts that are in the semifinals to prepare you for that? Or should you just do the best you can in quarterfinals first, and then worry about the semis and even up the ladder.
I say train for your level. Train for the level you're at right now, not the level you aspire to, especially if you're quarterfinalist trying to make semis. The cut line is so aggressive. From quarterfinals is this huge body of athletes, and then semifinals that's really elite people. So I have plenty of athletes who are 100 spots out from semis, and we don't do any running unless it's shuttle runs. And even though running is going to be 1 in 6 events at semis, because of what I said before about the cross-training value of running is really low. It doesn't transfer very well to the stuff that gets tested in quarterfinals. And when you do qualify for that next level, you get a windfall of confidence, and it changes your buy-in to the process. That seems to accelerate your progress, at least for a time. So I want to get people over whatever that cut line is.
What does the literature say about mental fatigue?
Mental fatigue inhibits physical performance in certain physical tests, but not others. So things that it doesn't seem to impair performance in is a 1 rep max, maximum voluntary contraction, or maximum power, or maximum anaerobic power. So maximum power would be like a 100-meter sprint. Maximum anaerobic power would be like 30 seconds all out one time. So it doesn't impair performance in any of those things, but pretty much everything else it will impair your performance in. So strength endurance performance, muscle endurance performance. If you're constantly at RPE 9 to 10 all the time, all year round, then for a lot of reasons, you're probably not going to progress optimally. If that were the best way to progress, then we would probably see endurance athletes doing that, but they don't. They do 1 to 3 quality sessions per week, and everything else is long, slow distance. So quality session just means anything that isn't low intensity. And as far as the mental fatigue goes, I just recommend that athletes try to reduce their mental fatigue as much as they can. So the less demanding you can make every other task in your life, the more automatic and routine you can make the rest of your life. So that training becomes your primary stressor. Then the better you'll perform in training, you'll get a bigger training stimulus, bigger adaptation.
Is there a point where people think that they don't have mental fatigue, but their performance says otherwise?
It seems the way that mental fatigue works is it makes you perceive more effort. So, and it works on elite athletes too. They've taken elite endurance athletes, and even in a test as short as 10 to 15 minutes, they will perform worse. They'll reach exhaustion quicker. It seems to be because they're perceiving more effort. It feels harder. And their physiological markers are the same. They just quit sooner. It just feels harder. That seems to be why mental fatigue impairs performance in those things, is it increases your perception of effort.
Give us an example of an ideal training day.
So the ideal times to train are 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. for most. Now, is that ideal for everyone no matter what? That's ideal if you're a professional and this is your vocation, you get paid to do this, and you have complete freedom to train. But that is dictated by your biology. It could be said that training at those times biologically, without all the other factors that come along with an individual of their other roles and responsibilities in life that interfere with training, that compete with training for their energy and time. Purely biologically speaking, 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. are the ideal times to train. And that's just your circadian biology. Your cortisol naturally peaks at those times based on the position of the sun. 2 sessions is not always better. That's one thing that I will emphasize, because if you are prioritizing strength and hypertrophy, or either one of those, then usually 2 sessions is not necessary. I get a lot of athletes who are prioritizing strength and hypertrophy who get worried about losing their aerobic fitness. But then when they go through an off season and they start doing Metcons again and everything feels so much easier, they're usually sold. You just have to go through it and really make appreciable gains in your strength so that you can feel that difference when you get back. Ideal training cycle for a year for a CrossFit athlete, I recommend competing 1 to 4 times a year. That's enough to get the competition experience you need.
Let's say they're bodybuilding And they can still go to a competition knowing that they're not going to do well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually I recommend my athletes compete 1 to 4 times a year. That's enough to get the competitive experience that you need while also training your weakness for enough time in the year. And that comes out to 2/3 to 3/4 of the year you're spending training your weakness. And another important thing to note on that is longer stretches of continuous time are better. So 16 weeks consecutive is better than 4 weeks with 3-week interruptions to prep for a competition. So because, yeah, there's lots of reasons for that, but the continuous big chunk of off season is a lot more productive. And the closer you get to the competition, the more you just want to be prepared for the competition, regardless of what your weakness is. That is the gradual transition from off season training to being in season.
Let's go back to another one that I actually missed. This is about the repeated bout effect.
Yeah, so the repeated bout effect just means that when you repeat the same exercise multiple weeks in a row, you experience less muscle damage, less muscle soreness, and similar amounts of muscle growth. Very good thing to take advantage of when you want muscle growth. And the reason that CrossFitters going to the box and doing constantly varied programming can experience lots of muscle soreness, really frequent muscle soreness, and sometimes really debilitating muscle soreness, but not experience any muscle growth is because they're constantly introducing novel stimuli. The way we reliably induce muscle soreness is with novel stimuli. And people have this notion that muscle soreness means muscle damage, which means hypertrophy. So the more sore I am, the more I damage the muscle, and the more the muscle will grow. And that's not how it works. 12 years ago, we might have thought, yeah, muscle damage is a mechanism of muscle growth, but it appears that it's not. Mechanical tension is the mechanism that drives muscle growth. So I'll kind of break this apart. So people have this notion that the more sore I am, the more I damage the muscle, the more the muscle will grow. Well, first of all, the extent of muscle soreness does not correlate well with the extent of muscle damage. So if you have muscle soreness, there probably is some muscle damage, but the extent of soreness does not correlate well with the extent of damage. And then damage itself is not a mechanism of muscle growth. So what is a mechanism of muscle growth is mechanical tension, which is a function of force and stretch. So when you apply a certain amount of mechanical tension to a muscle, you signal mechanoreceptors in the muscle that trigger muscle growth. And that's training with anything from your 1 to your 30 RM. And when you're doing CrossFit, not only are you doing lots of different exercises, so there's lots of novel stimuli, but you're often doing it with something lighter than your 30 RM, something you could do for 40 or 50, like a wall ball. And that's generally not enough mechanical tension to induce meaningful amounts of muscle growth. It will induce some, just like running a marathon will induce some, just like downhill running will induce some. But if we're talking about meaningful muscle growth response, then you need enough mechanical tension. Let me caveat that. So the other mechanism of hypertrophy is metabolic stress. And this is all the rage with the blood pressure cuffs, the occlusion techniques that people are using. So they're like cuffing their bicep and then doing a bunch of bicep curls. And you don't need as much mechanical tension through the bicep to induce muscle growth because you're getting all of this metabolic stress in the bicep that causes cell swelling and muscle growth. It's really more of a technique, in my opinion, for injured athletes or for bodybuilders or for injured bodybuilders, people who are trying to avoid mechanical tension intentionally. But in CrossFit, we usually are trying to get a bigger muscle so that we will have a stronger muscle. So if we can drive some of the neural mechanisms of strength, some neural adaptations along with the muscle growth, then that's generally better, which means, 5 to 10 RM instead of 20 to 30 RM with a blood pressure cuff.
How do you taper for a CrossFit competition?
3 to 10 days before the competition, you want to reduce training volume by at least 50%. So you can reduce it all the way to 0 if you want. I generally don't do that. I'll generally reduce it by about 50% and keep some intensity present up until 3 days before the competition. And then usually the final 3 days before is nominal stuff like blood flow, movement stuff, or complete training cessation. Yeah.
How should you fuel yourself as a competitor?
So around competition time, carb loading is probably a good strategy for CrossFit athletes. And carb loading is 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight in the days leading up to the competition. During the competition, it can become really impractical to eat that much during the competition, which is part of why you load before the competition. So that's, I think, something that is underutilized by CrossFitters. I think there's still some of the paleo, keto, carnivore influence and confusing of the intentions of health and performance when those are at the elite level of performance are very divergent paths. And so I think because of those influences, some even elite CrossFit competitors are hesitant to use some of these strategies. From some athletes have trouble eating the same amount of protein that they eat on a regular basis during the competition. If it's something like the games, then it becomes very hard to eat enough protein. Or I should say, it becomes very hard to eat the same amount of protein that you do on a regular training day. Because instead of, some days you're doing 4 events. It's like I literally am having a hard enough time just getting enough carbs in. And so you would prioritize the carbohydrates over the protein in that scenario. But generally I don't pull down protein on purpose going into a competition.
Is there anything else you want to add in terms of helping a competitor become better at CrossFit that we haven't talked about?
I would just say if you want to treat the sport as professionally as you can, then hire a coach. The 3 trends we've seen in every other sport are professionalization, individualization, and technology. So I don't know why CrossFit would be different. Those 3 things to me seem inevitable inside of CrossFit. And so the more you can lean into those things, the better, whether you're a pro or an amateur.
All right, Paul, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. Thanks for having me.
Hey, real quick, if you want to learn more about Paul Weber, I linked his information on the description. And if you're watching this on YouTube, it would mean so much to us if you like, comment, and subscribe so that hopefully the algorithm is going to pick this video up and share it to more people. Otherwise, I'm Clint. I'll see you next time.